Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Vorhies, your host. I'm the Editorial Director with Data Science Central and also Chief Data Scientist for Data Magnum. I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Trifacta for sponsoring today's event. Trifacta is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. Now, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Now, today's webinar is entitled Top 4 Excel Functions Done Better with Data Wrangling, to be presented by Trifacta. And before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's webinar. Today's event will be an hour long. We have two presenters who I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. So I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation, as we'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers, David McNamara with Trifacta and Tanya Cashorali with TCB Analytics. David is a customer success manager with 2.5 years of wrangling experience at Trifacta, working on solutions to use cases including healthcare, supply chain, media optimization, and marketing analytics. Tanya is the founding partner of TCB Analytics, a Boston-based data consultancy. Previously, she worked as a data scientist at Biogen. Tanya started her career in bioinformatics and has applied her experience to other data-rich verticals such as telecom, finance, and sports. So she brings over 10 years of experience using R in data scientist roles, as well as managing and training data analysts, and she's helped grow a handful of Boston startups. So David, Tanya, thanks for being with us today. We're looking forward to your presentation. Now, analysts have relied on Excel for decades, but the size, variety, and pace of data accelerates. Certain Excel functionality has begun to feel pretty archaic. So today's data wrangling platforms offer data analysts new approaches to preparing data that alleviate Excel bottlenecks. So in today's Data Science Central webinar, we'll demonstrate what features to look for in a leading data wrangling platform, and how to leverage data wrangling techniques to execute common Excel functions more effectively, including a side-by-side comparison of Excel versus a data wrangling platform, examples of real-world applications for data wrangling techniques, key functionality of a modern data wrangling platform. So David, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar on the top 4 Excel functions done better with data wrangling.
And today we'll be presented by, as Bill mentioned, Trifacta, who's a global leader in data wrangling software, and we partner with them, TCB Analytics, to bring those data wrangling solutions to some of our clients.
As Bill mentioned earlier, I'm David McNamara. I'm a customer success manager here at Trifacta, and I'm happy to present alongside Tanya Cashorali, founder and CEO of TCB Analytics. We've been working together for around a year now, and I'm really excited to be presenting alongside her. In today's webinar, we'll be discussing the history and legacy of Excel, as well as some of the limitations that data wrangling seeks to address. We'll give an overview of what data wrangling is and how it might help you. We'll also be covering 4 examples of functions done better by data wrangling in Trifacta, which include data profiling, data standardization, unions, and change over time calculations. And alongside each of these functions, we'll be giving demonstrations of that inside of Trifacta. And lastly, we will open up to some Q&A.
Great, so jumping into the legacy and limitations of Excel. So Excel is obviously vastly widespread tool. I think everyone here has probably heard about it and has used it. Founded in 1985 and used by over 700 million people today. It's obviously a great way to quickly look at, manipulate, manage, and analyze your data, maybe even do some basic charting. And as a result of such a widespread nature of using Excel and people being really comfortable working in it, their formulas and practices have kind of become the standard in the industry. But there's a lot of places where Excel does fall short, especially as we mentioned, the size and scale of data is rapidly growing. So I'm sure a lot of people here have had problems with volume. So the larger the data gets, the more clunky Excel will be. You may get crashes or slow performance when processing anything over maybe a few, it could be gigs, but it really starts to buckle, especially if you're getting into more complex data structures. So it doesn't handle unstructured data well, like JSON, which is a really common JavaScript object notation format. Not only that, but one of the most common problems is joining up data from disparate sources. And I see this a lot with my clients. They're trying to draw data from an Oracle database, a SQL Server database, maybe a combination of flat files, XML or JSON. And so getting a comprehensive, cohesive view of all of your data sources at once is pretty difficult to do in Excel. I've seen multiple worksheets, multiple tabs, and the ability to quickly draw from multiple sources is not something that we can really do in Excel. On top of that, the lack of automation leads to errors. It's not the most robust tool. I think it's great for ad hoc analysis and one-offs, but as soon as you start to make decisions and use Excel in production, you don't have as much reproducibility, and the risk of fat fingering or copy and pasting a cell error is abundant in Excel. I think we're moving on to a polling question here. Speaking of those fat fingering errors. And is this Jill? Are you all able to still hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Okay. Is someone conducting the poll?
Yep, go ahead. Feel free to move to the next slide and we'll see what the results are.
Great. So on average, we're looking at how many errors per cell do you think an Excel spreadsheet has. Most of you guessed 1 in 500. So that's about 43% of you. 1 in 1,000 is quite a few. And 1 in 100 and 1 in 50 are a little more at the bottom. So you all opted towards more errors per cell on average. And I think it's an interesting anecdote. There's a story called the London Whale, which was a more than $2 billion trading loss by JP Morgan in 2012. And all investigations and reports led to the fact that it was an Excel formula copy-pasting error. So big need for reproducibility and automation. And a particular customer example, one client of mine had a need to explore extremely large data sets, and they weren't able to pull these data sets into Excel. The size was just too large. They really needed to just explore and get an initial look and summary view of the data. Even loading the data into a database wasn't going to happen right away. It was that large and unstructured in some senses. So in order to integrate that large data set with their proprietary data, they obviously needed to know what was there, figure out how they were going to join it up, do any initial data QC and processing, and they were already using Excel on a day-to-day basis for most of their work. It just started to fall apart when they needed to scale that business, and the product was growing and bringing in more and more data sources. So this was an example where data wrangling came into play, and Trifacta ended up being a really good fit. So another polling question for the audience, if your data becomes too large for Excel, what do you end up doing? Do you ask IT to load the data into a database so that maybe the analyst can query it with some kind of BI tool, or at least your SQL analyst can query it? Do you use an add-on like Power Pivot or a Power BI tool? Or do you just ignore it and shelf it until you're able to handle data at that size and scale? Of course, there's another option, because I'm sure we didn't cover all of them here, but take the time now to think about this. And if other is irrelevant, that's another option. Maybe you haven't had to deal with large data yet. So I'll give you a few minutes to answer. And I'll let Bill or Jill forward when the collection is done. Great. So pretty evenly split. Most of you are not ignoring it, so you can handle the data. That's probably more sense of urgency. You probably need the data. Most of you are asking IT to load the data into a database or other, either large data sets aren't relevant to your business, or you have another solution that you're using. And maybe we'll get a chance to go into this with the audience at the end with Q&A to find out what that other was.
Okay, so what is data wrangling? Simply put, data wrangling is a user-friendly approach to preparing data that caters to Excel-savvy analysts, but is applied at scale with capabilities of big data platforms. Now, why is this important? More and more people are working directly with data in their day-to-day work. Data wrangling empowers analysts of all kinds to work closely with the data they know best, closer to the source. Best at scales not previously available to them. The repeatability and automation capable with Trifacta also saves enormous amounts of time, improves in efficiency and accuracy. This is in relation to copy and paste and some of the fat finger errors that Tanya had alluded to earlier, and ultimately saves organizations money. Now, how does Trifacta differ from tools like Excel? Try to pay attention to each of these differentiators as we go through a demonstration in just a moment, but Trifacta gives you robust interactive profiling information to help you explore the exact contents of your data. Through these interactions, Trifacta provides real-time intelligent suggestions to predict your next moves and guide your transformation process, while giving you feedback and previews at each step of the way. When you are ready to execute your transformations at scale, Trifacta determines the best execution frameworks to transform your data efficiently. And this is all done while natively integrating with existing frameworks to meet IT security and governance requirements. So now we'll be going into some demonstrations alongside the 4 functions done better with data wrangling.
So the first one of these is data profiling. As we were saying, looking at data, understanding what's there, getting a first look is the first step in any data analysis project. So the what of this is automated visualization of your data qualities and distribution. As you can see, some distributions on the screen here. And why do we need to do this? Well, you have to understand the content and what you're working with. If there are any anomalies within the data set, like outliers, missing data, unstandardized data, and in Excel, there's no quick visual way to do this or to easily identify outliers in a programmatic way. And so David will show us a demo of this, and we'll walk through exactly what it looks like within the Trifacta platform. So here you see, this is your main screen after you've loaded a data set into Trifacta. We've got all the various columns. David's scrolling to show that there are more columns, such as address state. This is the distribution of the various categories, obviously 51 states. You can see the green bars or green colors actually indicate good values. So Trifacta believes these are good formatted dates, for example. If we look at the red bar and click that, those are missing or mismatched values. So we can see that the date formats are inconsistent, and this is extremely common. Data is rarely perfectly standardized and formatted when it comes in. The black values are actually missing data, so we can go into more column details and see that at a higher view. So it looks like about 10% missing. We do get some of the mismatch values over on the right, what some of the top values are. So January 2016, the 19th is the most common, and we get just a nice summary view of this column. Various weekdays, days of the month, and so on. So we do have to deal with these mismatched values. So let's go into standardization. And we'll just go back to the slides. So data standardization is obviously another first step when you're preparing data for analysis. And as we saw, there were mismatched formats of dates. We often see this with phone numbers, sometimes addresses. And what it does is it's an automatic recognition of these patterns. And oftentimes you need this to also join data sets together. So your join keys need to be standardized as well. And we need to do this typically to pull in new data, join these disparate sources together. Like I said, my client was dealing with integrating a massive data set, so we really needed to standardize various fields across the data sets in order to create a more robust analysis. And I've never really been able to do regular expressions or pattern matching in Excel very easily. So we'll show you now how we can do that within Trifacta as well. And we'll switch back to where we just left off. So here we are again with the start date. And we switch to the Patterns tab. And now you'll notice out of the 8,000 or so patterns, approximately 7,000 have this 4-digit year, /month, /day, whereas the less common pattern is approximately 2K of them have the 3-letter abbreviation of a month, 2 digits, and then the 4-digit year. There's obviously many more date formats that are possible. Trifacta would detect all of them. But what we can do now is if we click on the first one, we get a predictive suggestion over on the right. So it's guessing, do you want to convert those values that are like April 12, 2012, meaning the 3-digit month abbreviation, to this format. And we can even see what the effects will be on that little hover window. So yes, we want to do that. We'll add it to our recipe. And now we can see that they're all 8,000 of them are now the same format. So we've standardized that column pretty quickly. And going back to the main Explorer view, we now don't see any red in the histogram for start date.
Okay, so that leads us now to our next function, which are unions. So unions are the programmatic alignment of columns to automatically append new data as it comes in. This is generally used when you have reoccurring data extracts or data dumps into a file system. When appending data in spreadsheets, you either have to copy and paste, which is very error-prone, or use some sort of nasty nested formula. If other data preparation steps are needed to wrangle the data, they have to be repeated from scratch each time that you append new data in. And additionally, you're constrained to using Excel files local to your computer. So in the example I'll be showing, we have 6 different yearly transactional files that we will union together. So again, going to share my screen here. And we're going to go ahead and jump to a different data set. So one thing to notice is that I've already built up this set of logical steps that we call a recipe in Trifacta on top of our 2010 transactions data. You can see, again, getting some profiling information here. We only have data from the year 2010. But let's say we have 5 other transaction files for the years 2011 and 2015, and we want to apply all of the data wrangling logic that we've applied to 2010 to those subsequent years. So what I can do is I can go back to the beginning of my recipe. I'm going to add a union here. And I'll go ahead and select all of those files that I alluded to, so 2015, 14, 13, 11, and 12, and I will add and align by name. Once these have been aligned, I can always go back and double check, again, some further profiling information to validate that the union appends all of the data together that I'm seeking to append. If this union did not pick up every column that I wanted to union together, say the structure or the column names differed, I can always go ahead and manually adjust my unions to make sure that every column I want included in my output is present there. Whenever I'm ready, I can go ahead and add this to my recipe. Trifacta is going to apply the union. And then when I want to apply all of the steps that I've built out in my recipe to all 6 of these transaction files, I can just click to the end of my recipe here, and all of those steps have now been applied. And again, just to validate that everything is here, I can see in this year transaction date column that I have years spanning from 2010 to 2015. So that then brings us to our final function. Changeover time calculations. Changeover time calculations allow you to follow trends in time series data. They can provide important information on success factors and trend analysis. Now, Excel makes for simple changeover time calculations when measuring with a single variable, but can quickly become difficult when you need additional levels of detail. In the next example, I'll show how you can measure the % difference of sales over each time interval for each product in our catalog. So one more time, I'm going to share my screen here. And enter back into Trifacta. And again, we'll be working with the same data set that we just unioned together. So now let's say I want to take this sum of discounted ticket price and see what kind of trends are going on inside of our data, how our data progresses over time, and say I want to get an additional level of detail, which is going to be change over time for each product in our catalog. So what I can do is click on the column drop-down here for this sum discounted ticket price. I can go to this formula tab and simply do % difference from previous value. Now this is going to give me a template step that I can work with. So let's say I also want to make sure that I'm ordering by the month. This is giving us the change over time, over months and years of all of our sales. But let's say I want to narrow my focus to the individual products as well. So now if I look at a preview of what's going on here, I can see that for the product gold in the year 2010, again, ordered by month. You can see the percent change in sales over time with each level of detail that I alluded to earlier. So something that's really simple to do in Trifacta, only requires a few clicks and doesn't require any sort of nested formula building or additional charting functions to accomplish. When I'm ready, I can go ahead and add that to my recipe. And lastly, in addition to the ease of use with Trifacta, the scale that Trifacta allows for with big data platforms and the automation capabilities that are not available in tools like Excel, you can also share your work in Trifacta with your team and collaborate on projects together. Sharing of spreadsheets carries risks and also a loss of lineage. It's hard to track who's made changes to the spreadsheets, where they've last been touched, where they originated from, and so on. Trifacta retains lineage and integrates with the existing governance platforms, which in turn enables teams to share work and collaborate on projects, which can accelerate learning and the transfer of knowledge within an organization. So that's it for this webinar. So now it looks like we'll have a little bit of extra time for Q&A. So make sure that you submit any questions that you have, and I will let Bill take it from here.
Well, David and Tanya, thanks for that excellent presentation. And we'll get started with today's Q&A. And I want to thank the audience for their participation. We've had a lot of questions that have come in, and we'll do our best to get through them all in the time remaining. So during this Q&A session, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for David and Tanya if you'd like to contact them following today's webinar. So let's get started. A lot of questions have come in. So David, Tanya, obviously the blending feature is the most obvious thing that Trifacta does, perhaps that Excel doesn't do. Can you talk about the types of sources that Trifacta can connect to, and tell us a little bit about database types like Oracle or SQL Server, or even formats like SAS files?
Sure. Yeah, I can go ahead and take this question. So Trifacta integrates with all sorts of sources, whether it's relational databases like Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, so on. Also, big data platforms can connect to HDFS, Hive, things like MongoDB. In addition to that, obviously, we support local files, flat files on your desktop, and also can connect to a few platforms like Salesforce. What's important to note, as Bill has alluded to, is that you can connect and blend various sources to each other. So if you have a flat file that you're looking to blend with data from a relational database, that is something that you're more than able to do within Trifacta. The last piece of that, I believe, was data structures. So we accept CSVs, text files. We also work with JSON. We can work with XML. So there's a lot of different file formats that we are able to work with. And again, you can pair those text files or those JSON files with data from HDFS, with data from Oracle, with data from Postgres, and so on.
Well, David, thanks for that clarification. There were specific questions about whether or not you accepted SAS and SPSS format files.
I don't believe we accept SAS or SPSS formats. That would be something that you would probably want to check on our website to make sure that I'm not misquoting that. But I'm sure there's other ways of formatting those outputs as well to take those files in. If the question is whether or not we also accept the logic that's built up in SAS or SPSS, I don't think that's something that we integrate with currently.
Okay, well, thanks. And of course, the other thing that, after we've done our data blending and cleaning that we want to do is we want to do data visualization. So does Trifacta chart in the same manner that Excel does, or do I export to a BI tool like Tableau, or what's the best practice?
Tanya, do you want to take a stab at that one, and I'll fill in anything?
Yeah, sure. I think they're separate tools for separate needs. So Trifacta is much more on the data prep, getting it ready for your analysis. So what it does do is you can create, when you've done all your transformations and joins and your data is ready to be analyzed further, you can either export to, if the data is really large, to a database or Hive, or directly to a Tableau data extract, which will allow you to open it up in Tableau, which is a business intelligence tool. Trifacta is not really trying to be a business analytics tool, and then you do your analysis in there. So I'd say they're very complementary, but different tools.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. And just to add on top of that, Bill, we do have data visualization built into the product, as you saw in some of the demos, but that's very much used to guide the transformation process, to measure data quality, and to initiate transformations. And that's not meant to be used as an analytics platform or a visualization or BI tool.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen that you were demonstrating, I saw back there something that looked very much like a script. Am I able to run that on a schedule when I've got new data? What happens when new data comes in and it needs to be added to what I've got?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So we do have built-in scheduling capabilities built into the user interface. So what this allows you to do is list a scheduled time that you would like jobs to trigger. So let's say it's every week on Sunday at midnight. What will happen is as data populates that database or that directory, whenever that schedule is triggered, Trifacta will apply the recipe that you've built, that recipe that we showed in the demonstration. It will apply that to the new data as it comes in and push back out an output that has that new data with all of the logic applied to it.
Okay. And by the way, would that include live data feeds?
It can. The schedule is not going to be, so the output is not going to be generated in a live real-time fashion. It will be generated every time that schedule is triggered. Now, you can be fairly granular with that schedule. So if you want data to be updated and populated on a, say, 15-minute basis or a 5-minute basis, you have the flexibility to do that. But the output is not going to have the recipe applied to it in real time.
Right, not streaming, but certainly most of us can do with fast update, especially if we're feeding a screen of some sort. There are several questions about output file types. Could you just run output file through output file types? And one I've not run into before was a pipe delimited file.
Yes. So the output types that we support are CSV, JSON, Avro, Parquet, and TDE, which Tanya alluded to earlier, the Tableau data extract. So we are able to write back to HDFS, to S3, back to relational databases, and also just as a local file that you can download onto your computer. And you can create the output with those file types.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that clarification. Here's a question from the audience that I think I know the answer to, but I guess I should ask it. And that is, the audience member believes that it looks like Trifacta is working on a sample of the data rather than the entire data set. Is that the case, or are we looking at the entire data set?
That is the case, yeah. So we populate the grid, the data that you see in the user interface, with a 10 megabyte sample. We have many different sampling methods that you can choose from, so random samples, stratified samples, filter-based samples, anomaly samples to populate the grid with all of the missing and mismatched data that's present in your file. So there's a lot of different sampling techniques to make sure that the representative sample that you have in the grid has all of the necessary features of your data that is present in your entire file. The reason for this is when we're working with very large scales of data, think in the hundreds of gigabytes or even terabyte range, to be able to function in that user interface in a performant manner would require an enormous amount of resources. So using the resources that are local to your computer, we can work with the sample to allow those sort of real-time feedback transformation steps. And then when you're ready to apply all of the logic that you've built inside of the Trifacta user interface, that's when you run the job, use one of the various execution frameworks that we support, and apply all of that logic at scale.
Okay, and I presume that means that this is an enterprise version where the data is local on, though I presume it could also be cloud.
Yeah. So we do have 3 versions. If you're interested in learning a bit more, you can go to our website and check out the 3 different products that we have. We have a free product that supports local files from your desktop. We have a pro version, which is a cloud-based product. And we also have the enterprise version, which operates on-premise, as you alluded to. And we also have products in the AWS marketplace. We are inside of Google Cloud Platform, GCP, as Google Data Prep, and we also have an offering in Azure. So there's various product offerings that we offer to sort of meet your organization's needs.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Some other audience questions, and this one I think is an interesting procedural issue, and that is as we get new data added to our file on a periodic basis, daily, hourly, by the second, there is some standardization that goes on prior to joining it with other data. Does all of that happen within Trifacta? In other words, new data coming in runs through a script that does the preliminary cleaning and then does the joining that I want? Have I got that right?
Yeah, so the order at which you do that process is up to the user. So if some standardization needs to be done before doing a join, you have the flexibility to do that. You can also join right off the bat at the beginning of your recipe. But all of the joining, all of the unioning, all of the steps you do to clean your data, to standardize your data, and restructure your data, all of that is done within the recipe. So you're working within that user interface to do all of those various processes. So you don't have to work through a different interface for each of those steps.
Okay.
Does that
good.
answer the question?
I believe so, and so the audience has also asked, is it possible to change the order of the steps in that script on the fly, or does that mean I've written a whole new script?
Yep, you can absolutely reorder the steps. So if you saw from the demo how I was able to add a union at the beginning of my recipe before all of those steps that I had already applied, likewise, you can go anywhere in your recipe, add new steps. You can copy steps from later in your recipe and paste them back in at the beginning of your recipe or in the middle of your recipe. There's sort of a lot of flexibility with how you can do that. Okay,
terrific. Now, do we assume that Trifacta can do everything that Excel can do? For example, stuff like sum-if functions, or do I need to, at some point, export back into Excel to do some of the fancier stuff that Excel can do?
Yes, great question as well. We support nearly all of the Excel functions that you are used to. We've tried to base a lot of the functions that we have in the product off of Excel's functions. So for instance, sum-if, as you mentioned, is something that you are able to do in Trifacta as well. So when you're working within Trifacta and you're in any of the formula parameters, you can see the whole list of functions that we support, and those should align pretty closely with all of the functions that you're familiar with in a tool like Excel.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned early in the presentation Power BI and Power Query, and an audience member is asking if they are already using those tools, what's the additional value of adding Trifacta to that?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely familiar with Power BI and Power Query. I do believe that there are still data volume limits that aren't very large in Power BI and Power Query. I think it's around 2 gigabytes, if I'm not mistaken. So
yeah,
not
Power
only
Pivot has a 4 gigabyte limit or so.
Yeah, I mean, Tanya, do you want to speak to that question?
Yeah. I noticed, too, some questions about why we're not just use pandas or R, and I'm a long-time R user, and I love it, but there's a couple different reasons why you'd use Trifacta versus R. So one, if the data is really, really large, right? There was one problem where it was easier and faster for me to just use R to wrangle the data myself and hand it off to someone because it was smaller. However, you use a collaborative effort, so what we're trying to also get business analysts and self-service and enablement happening here. So you're able to collaborate more and more effectively if you can work within the same environment. And not everyone's going to learn or pick up Python or R. So that's one reason. The other is just pure scale. So once we had the data loaded into an HDFS cluster, for example, I was able to very quickly run jobs in less than 10 minutes or so on 300 plus gigs of data, whereas if I were to try to parallelize that all myself and set up the infrastructure to do that myself in R, it just didn't have the time and resources at that point. So I think it's a collaboration and scaling issue, which of course is possible in R, but just takes a bit more engineering efforts and IT infrastructure.
Well, Tanya, thanks. And by the way, you mentioned something in that answer that I wanted to confirm, and that is I presume that Trifacta will execute over HDFS or other NoSQL databases. Is that correct?
Yes. I don't know the extent of all the databases since they're always adding more and more connectors, but haven't had any limitations just yet. And even going back to the SAS or SPSS problem, I'd probably just convert the SAS file to an R object or data frame and then load it into Trifacta if necessary to give my colleagues access to now analyze that data.
Okay. And maybe a last technical question. When you are looking at duplicates during merge match, how do you deal with those in selecting which is the keeper row and which is the discard row?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay, I was just going to say there's a few ways that you can identify duplicate rows in Trifacta and use additional columns as your prioritization technique. So we do have a deduplicate transform, which will deduplicate any rows that are duplicates in their entirety, so all columns are the same. If that's not the case, then there's a lot of flexibility with how you identify those duplicate rows. So you can do row number grouped by all of the columns that you want to check for duplicate values, and then you can create criteria based off of other columns on how you want to prioritize that. This is something that we've actually implemented at a few customers that I've been working with a lot of success, because that's a challenge that is fairly difficult to do with more traditional tools.
Okay. Well, thanks for that clarification. You know, as a last question, let me ask you about the clients that you've got that have deployed Trifacta. Has there been some trigger event or trigger circumstance that caused them to throw up their hands and say, we got to switch, that this represents a set of most common problems that clients experience and then decide, well, okay, it's time for Trifacta?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the self-service tools and enablement. So when you're starting to get more and more disparate sources, and especially when you're building data products, you really want your whole team diving into data, not just the data scientists or not just the data engineers. So I think it gets to that point where it's either scale or collaboration, or you're seeing a bunch of repeatable patterns and methods taking place. You're constantly joining new data together that's coming in on a regular basis, or you're constantly cleaning and standardizing data. That's at a point where you probably want to go to a tool like Trifacta, but I can't stress the enablement enough. I've seen clients suddenly being able to derive much new product features and just do more innovation because everyone's able to get their hands on the data, and they're not waiting for IT, for example, to get them an extract from the database of the data. They're not waiting days or weeks. They're able to immediately dive in and really get their hands dirty.
Yeah, I'm sure IT thanks you very much. David, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I thought Tanya covered that perfectly. I think the range of situations that have led people to adopt Trifacta varies, but a very common one is just getting frustrated with having to do the same process over and over again in Excel. Every time new data comes in, that sort of ad hoc nature of Excel, having to do, the same transformation process can get very time-consuming and tedious. So being able to build out a recipe in Trifacta to wrangle those files and do that on a recurrent basis is a huge time saver for a lot of analysts who want to spend most of their time doing the fun stuff like analytics and visualization and data modeling and so on, and want to have sort of a process in place to wrangle their data with data that they're familiar with.
Right, yeah. Okay, well, David, Tanya, thank you for some great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions that weren't answered today, we'll be sending all the unanswered questions to David and Tanya and the Trifacta team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. I have just a few quick announcements. If you'd please mark your calendars for March 27th, that's our next DSC webinar, which will be Break Barriers to Insight by Revolutionizing Your Analytics, and that'll be sponsored by Alteryx. Also remember, today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today, and you can find that on the home page of Data Science Central in the Webinar tab, located at the top of the page. Well, this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions, and a special thanks again to Trifacta for their sponsorship, and particularly to our speakers today, David McNamara and Tanya Cashorali, for their insight into today's topic. This is Bill Vorhies. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again on March 27th. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.